The sun beat down on the Valley of Whispers, a merciless, white-hot hammer that baked the dust and rock into a shimmering haze. For the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, it was the third day of a grueling advance, a slow, methodical push through a canyon that their commander, Colonel Matthews, had assured them was secure. Matthews was a man of impeccable record and rigid doctrine. He believed in maps, in timetables, and in the unshakable certainty of his plan. His executive officer, Major Evans, was a mirror image of his commander's confidence, a man who saw the world through the clean, predictable lines of military strategy. In the back of a stuffy communications truck, Sergeant Elena Torres felt the vibration of the convoy through the floor plates, a low, rhythmic rumble that did nothing to soothe the cold knot of dread in her stomach. She was a comms sergeant, a glorified radio operator in the eyes of the infantry officers. Her job was to ensure the lines of communication remained open, a technical role far removed from the high art strategy. But Elena saw more than radio frequencies. She saw patterns. She had spent the last 2 days monitoring the faint, almost undetectable enemy chatter on the far side of the ridges, and the pattern was wrong. It was too quiet, too disciplined. It felt less like the disorganized insurgency they had been briefed on and more like a predator waiting in ambush. She had voiced her concerns to Major Evans that morning, pointing out on a topographical map how the valley's natural acoustics could be used to create dead zones to mask a larger force. He had dismissed her with a condescending pat on the shoulder. "Leave the thinking to the commanders, Sergeant. You just keep the comms up." Now, as the convoy rumbled deeper into the narrowest part of the canyon, the feeling was stronger than ever. This wasn't a valley. It was a tomb. Her fingers hovered over her console, her internal monologue a whirlwind of tactical analysis she had been trained to suppress. Asterisk choke point ahead. No air cover due to signal interference. Our column is too condensed. It's a classic funnel ambush. Asterisk she had been taught by the best, in a program so advanced and so experimental that its graduates were considered a new breed of strategic thinker. A program she had been quietly pushed out of for being too radical, too defiant, too willing to challenge the rigid doctrines of men like Matthews and Evans. She was supposed to be a failure, but her training had never left her. The first explosion was a deep, guttural roar that ripped the air apart. A massive IED detonated at the head of the column, peeling a tank open like a tin can. Almost simultaneously, a second blast rocked the rear, sealing the exit. They were trapped. The canyon walls erupted in a storm of heavy machine gun fire and RPGs. The ambush was perfectly sprung, a wall of steel and fire that tore into the stalled convoy. In the command vehicle, Colonel Matthews was shouting orders when a high-velocity, armor-piercing round slammed through the cab. The command net, the digital lifeline of the entire battalion, went silent. A voice, choked with panic, came over his secondary channel. "Warlord 6 is down. I repeat, Warlord 6 is gone." The commander had fallen. The battalion was a headless serpent, caught in a death trap. Major Evans's voice, tight and strained, cut through the chaos a moment later. "All call signs. This is Warlord 5. I have command. Establish a defensive perimeter. All units hold your position and return fire. Air support is on the way." It was the textbook response. It was also a death sentence. In her truck, Elena's screens lit up with new data. She was intercepting the enemy's fire control communications. They weren't just pinning the Marines down. They were using the suppressive fire to keep them stationary, to hold them in place. Her blood ran cold. She cross-referenced the enemy comms with artillery trajectory data. They were in a kill box. The enemy was using the initial ambush to zero in their mortars and rocket artillery for a final, annihilating barrage. They weren't trying to fight the Marines. They were trying to erase them. "Warlord 5, this is Valkyrie," she said, using her station's call sign, her voice cutting through the comms with urgent precision. "You have to get the men moving. This is a coordinated trap. They are registering our positions for an artillery strike. We need a breakout now." There was a pause, filled with the roar of gunfire. Then Evans's voice, laced with fury and disbelief, shot back. Sergeant, you will maintain radio discipline and stick to your function. I am in command here. My orders are to hold this position. You will follow them. Sir, those orders will get every single one of us killed, she pleaded, her voice rising. The artillery is coming. That is enough, he roared. One more word from you, and I will have you shot for mutiny. Hold your position. That is a final order. He cut her channel. Elena stared at her console, at the blinking icons representing 400 Marines, all holding their ground, all waiting to be slaughtered because their commander was following a playbook the enemy had already read. The first mortar shells screamed overhead, landing just beyond the perimeter. They were ranging shots. The storm was about to break. She had a choice: follow orders and die, or commit an act of defiance so profound it could either save them all or end her career in front of firing squad. Her training, the very thinking that had gotten her ostracized, provided the only answer. Sometimes, to save the army, you had to break its rules. Her fingers flew across her console. With her high-level access codes, a ghost from her past life, she entered the network's command core. She locked Major Evans out, seizing control of the entire battalion's communication net. A single red light glowed on her board. Network priority, Valkyrie. She took a deep, steadying breath. Her voice, when it came, was not the voice of a sergeant. It was the voice of a commander. It was calm, absolute, and radiated an authority that transcended rank. It was the voice of their last and only hope. All call signs. This is Valkyrie Actual. Her voice cut across every headset in the valley, silencing all other chatter. Colonel Matthews has fallen. I am assuming tactical command under the Emergency Continuity Directive. Major Evans, hearing her broadcast, began screaming her name, but his transmissions went nowhere. She had silenced him. Your current positions are a kill box, she continued, her tone leaving no room for doubt. Awaiting artillery. The order to hold is rescinded. We are breaking out. Now, execute emergency protocol Shattered Crown. I say again, all units execute Shattered Crown. Acknowledge. The valley was filled with a moment of stunned, absolute silence, broken only by the whine of incoming shells. Shattered Crown. No one had heard of it. It wasn't a real protocol. It was a name she had just invented for an insane, desperate gamble. What the hell is Shattered Crown? A company captain's voice asked over the net, laced with confusion. It means you get off the valley floor. Elena's voice commanded, sharp and clear. Ditch all non-essential gear. Break into fire teams. You are to scale the canyon walls. Scatter and climb. Use the rocks for cover. The enemy expects us to be a single, static target. We will become a swarm. The high ground is our only chance of survival. Move. Now. For a split second, there was hesitation. A communication sergeant had just staged a digital coup and was giving an order that went against every doctrine they had ever been taught. It was madness. But then another salvo of mortars landed, this time closer, wiping out an entire platoon. The choice was clear: follow the dead commander's last order and die, or trust the strange, commanding voice that was offering the only sliver of hope. Bravo company copies. Executing Shattered Crown, one captain finally said. Charlie company copies, said another. One by one, the company commanders acknowledged the order. The battalion, a force of over 400 Marines, began to move. They abandoned their vehicles, shedding their heavy packs, and began to scramble up the treacherous, rocky slopes of the canyon walls. It was a chaotic, desperate, but coordinated retreat from the kill zone. Major Evans, his face crimson with rage, had abandoned his post and was sprinting toward the comms truck. He was going to arrest her, to stop this mutiny himself. He kicked the door of her truck open just as the sky fell. A rolling, thunderous barrage of high-explosive artillery shells descended upon the valley floor. The ground erupted in a cataclysmic storm of fire, shrapnel, and smoke. The very rock of the canyon shook. The place where the Marine Battalion had been dug in moments before was now a roaring inferno, a landscape of pure, unadulterated destruction. Evans was thrown from his feet by the shockwave. He lay on the ground, staring at the apocalyptic scene, his ears ringing, his mind unable to process what he was seeing. He looked at the empty positions, the burning vehicles. They would all be dead, every single one of them. He then looked up at the canyon walls, and there they were. Small groups of Marines, like ants, were climbing, moving, finding cover in the high rocks. They were scattered. They were exposed, but they were alive. He slowly got to his feet and turned to the comms truck. Elena stood in the doorway, her face streaked with grime, a headset still clamped over her ears. She was looking at him, her expression not triumphant, but grim, focused. She had not been wrong, and he had almost gotten them all killed. In that moment, he wasn't a major and she wasn't a sergeant. He was a man who had failed, and she was the woman who had defied him to save everyone. The artillery barrage lasted for 3 solid minutes, a relentless, earth-shattering storm that turned the valley floor into a moonscape of craters and burning wreckage. When it finally stopped, an eerie silence descended, broken only by the crackle of fires and the distant shouts of the enemy, who believed they had just annihilated a U.S. Marine battalion. From their new, scattered positions high on the canyon walls, the Marines of the 1st Battalion watched. They were battered, shaken, but they were alive. Sergeant Elena Torres's insane order had saved them. In her comms truck, which had been shielded from the worst of the blast by a rock outcropping, Elena was no longer just a comms tech. She was the central nervous system of a newly reconstituted fighting force. All call signs, report. She commanded over the net she now controlled. Reports trickled in. Companies were fragmented, but largely intact. Casualties were minimal compared to what they would have been. Most importantly, they now held the high ground. They could see the enemy's positions, the artillery batteries, the command posts, all laid out below them. The trap had been turned. The hunters had become the hunted. Major Evans stumbled into her truck, his face pale, his uniform covered in dust. He stared at her, at the quiet sergeant who was now calmly coordinating a battalion-level counterattack. The arrogance was gone from his eyes, replaced by a look of stunned, horrified awe. "Ow," he began, his voice a hoarse whisper. "How did you know?" "They were too disciplined," Elena said without looking up from her screen. "Their fire patterns weren't meant to kill us. They were meant to pin us. It was a classic artillery trap. You were just too close to see it." She pointed to a holographic map of the valley. "Now, they think we're gone. Their guard is down. I'm directing Charlie Company to flank their primary mortar position. I need Bravo to lay down suppressive fire from this ridge. Can you coordinate that, Major? Or do you wish to relieve me of command?" The question was a challenge, a test. Evans looked at the map, at the brilliant, unorthodox strategy she had laid out. It was risky, but it was genius. He knew in that moment that he was out of his depth. He had been trained to fight a war of straight lines, and she was a master of a war of circles and shadows. He picked up a radio handset. "No, Sergeant," he said, the word sergeant now sounding like a title of respect. "Give me my orders." For the next hour, they worked together, the major becoming the willing hand of the sergeant's strategic brain. Elena's commands were calm, precise, and lethal. She directed the scattered fire teams with the skill of a grandmaster playing a chess game. They hit the enemy from a dozen different angles, a swarm of ghosts that seemed to be everywhere at once. The enemy, who had been preparing to survey their victory, were thrown into chaos. Their command structure broke down under the relentless, multi-directional assault. By the time reinforcements and air support finally arrived, the battle was over. The enemy was in full retreat, leaving their dead and their equipment behind. The 1st Battalion had not only survived, they had won a decisive victory. When the dust settled, General Peterson, the commander of the entire task force, landed his helicopter in the scarred valley. He had heard the fragmented, unbelievable reports. A battalion wiped out, then resurrected. A rogue comm sergeant taking command. He found Major Evans and Sergeant Torres standing over the tactical map. "Major," the general began, his face grim, "I'm going to need a full report. And it had better explain what the hell happened here. I have reports of a mutiny." Evans stood tall. "There was no mutiny, sir. There was a failure of command. Mine." Sergeant Torres recognized a threat I did not. She took the action necessary to save the lives of this battalion. I will be recommending her for the Navy Cross." The general looked from Evans to Elena, his eyes narrowing. He recognized something in her, a stillness, an intelligence that was far beyond her rank. He had seen the initial casualty estimates. He knew that by all rights, he should be standing in a graveyard. "Sergeant Torres," he said, his voice softening, "where did you learn to command like that?" Elena met his gaze. "I had a good teacher, sir." The formal inquiry was held a week later in a secure tent at the main operating base. Major Evans gave his testimony, taking full responsibility for his errors in judgment and praising Elena's actions without reservation. The company captains all testified that her order, while shocking, had undoubtedly saved their lives. But the real turning point came when General Peterson brought in another man, a stern-faced, gray-haired officer from the Army War College. He placed a thin, heavily redacted file on the table. "4 years ago, the officer began, we ran an experimental program called the Athena Initiative. It was designed to identify and cultivate a new kind of strategic thinker, soldiers who could see the battlefield in unorthodox ways. The final test was a simulation almost identical to the situation the 1st Battalion faced in the Valley of Whispers." He paused, looking at Elena. Only one student in the program's history correctly identified the trap and formulated a successful counter-strategy. A strategy she called Shattered Crown. The room was silent. "That student was Sergeant Torres," the officer continued. "She passed the course with the highest marks in its history. But her final recommendation was that her methods were too radical, too defiant of the established chain of command. She was deemed unfit for a traditional command path and was transferred to a communications role." General Peterson closed the file. "It seems we were the ones who failed the test. Not you, Sergeant." The inquiry was over. The mutiny charge was dropped. Elena was not punished. She was celebrated. The story of the sergeant who seized command and saved her battalion became a quiet legend, a lesson taught in the halls of the War College about the difference between following orders and upholding one's duty. 2 weeks later, Elena stood in General Peterson's office. He handed her a small box. Inside were the gold bars of a second lieutenant. "A battlefield commission," he said. "The first of many, I suspect. Major Evans has requested to serve as your executive officer. It seems he thinks he still has a few things to learn." Elena looked at the bars in her hand. She had never wanted command, but she had been forged for it. Her defiance had not been an act of rebellion. It was an act of profound loyalty to the lives of the soldiers she had sworn to serve. "Thank you, sir," she said, her voice steady. As she walked out of the office, she passed Major Evans. He didn't speak. He just smiled and rendered sharp, perfect salute. She returned it. The commander had fallen, but a new one had risen in his place, not by rank, but by the sheer, undeniable force of her will.